Yay, here we go. Friends. Yay. Allergies. Ready to go? Oh no. Are we okay?
It's like not like I grew up in a really cold climate, so when it gets really hot and dry out.
Do you want a wet cloth? Does that help?
No, it's
No, okay. I'll give you a minute. Yeah. No.
Yeah.
See, we're not in a hurry. We've got a couple minutes.
You want one of the sign? Okay, yeah.
My God, Paul, I did not recognize you. Paul, come and sit in on the honors conference. Come and listen. Oh, you have section. All right. Okay. Good to see you. I will see you afterwards. Okay. I'm waiting for the final guests. Great hair. Great. Okay. Go. Ready to go. Wait for people to sit down and bed. Have a seat. Mic back on. Great. I'll wait for you. There's no rush. Hello? It's working? So good to see everyone here. Thank you so much for coming out and supporting our honor students. My name is Alice Staveley, and I'm director of the honors program here in the English department, Stanford University. My role means many wonderful things, not least of which is the distinct privilege I have had since admitting these students last spring of watching these 9 very different but equally ambitious projects develop. From their tentative exploratory beginnings through eager and struggling middles to the accomplished, critically bold, and adventurous arguments you are soon to hear, these honors projects represent the highest and most challenging investment these students could have chosen amongst the many paths toward the Bachelor of Arts degree. As a department, we are enormously proud of their work and dedication to scholarship. Their advisors and graduate mentors have done the heavy lifting with them, week to week and month to month, for which no thanks is fully adequate. Now, from my view, the view from the spire, as it were, I'd like to offer, however, a small taste of what I have learned from working with the honors very hefty theses sitting on my office floor this past week. Now, when we met in the fall quarter to begin what many now probably understand as the odyssey of the honors experience, I remember telling them that writing is tough, that the year's work would be a marathon, not a sprint. The honors year itself is not only long, extending over all 3, if not 4 quarters. The honors thesis is long. It clocks in at 40 to 60 pages, footnotes and works cited not included. No one before beginning this year had probably written anything of that length or depth or spent so much time thinking about one topic. So the communal effort to understand not just one's own sources or topic, but the parameters of the quest object, the finished thesis, was crucial. Students shared ideas, read each other's work, debated readings outside their own fields of interest, and made often surprising connections across topic, time, place, and discipline. They swapped impasses and difficulties, challenged one another, and learned to accept shared input into the final output of the thesis itself. We don't always do a good job in the humanities of recognizing just how social is or should be the production of humanistic knowledge. But these students were learning something important in all their group activity. They were learning to speak to and to hear one another, even as they spoke increasingly deftly to the rather more distant critics, past and present, who shape their disciplinary terrains. You will hear in all of these talks today how very well situated within particular critical discourses these theses are. Reading, talking, writing, and sharing began to work in concert to move these students all forward to what must have seemed at times, I'm sure, a horizonless endpoint. The great novelist and essayist Virginia Woolf once wrote, "To know whom to write for is to know how to write." What these students were learning was something similar, that we write for others as much as for ourselves, and to know who those others are is to know who we might become. In such a crucible is truly original intellectual work forged. But all this brings me to a rather more intimate communal space, that space inscribed in the opening acknowledgement section of each and every thesis, which for now, I'm the only one to have read in total. Of course, until all of these theses are archived digitally in the Stanford Library. Acknowledgements are conventionally written last, but they speak to the origins of some communal but often ineffable pact between writer and reader that has sustained the student scholar in moments of doubt and disarray. Today, here, we welcome and celebrate many of the parents, advisors, mentors, and friends referenced in these acknowledgements who are present in this very room, and thanks to our live YouTube video stream across the country and the world. We are so very grateful for your presence. In prose, you have been honored in profound ways. We are a department with leading intellectual scholars who nonetheless tutor and challenge their undergraduate advisees so closely that they have become, in the words of one student, a dear friend. For another, a voice heard in every chapter of this thesis. And for another, someone who helped me ask questions that matter. Stanford's vast human resources, from librarians to resource specialists to writing center tutors, have all played roles in the making of these theses. Closer to home, other families who have stood beside our thesis writers, especially the parents who have had to trust, as all parents must, their children's own instincts. "There is no lanyard I can give," writes one student, "no poem I can write, or words I can say to ever repay all you have done." "Thank you," writes another, "for instilling in me a fascination with and reverence for the American West." For another, gratitude comes wrapped in a loving memory. "Thanks," she writes, "for always encouraging me to follow my passions and for not minding if I read under the table during dinner." Finally, I want to thank all the people here in the department who have made my job so much easier. Professor Alex Wallach, as department chair, is deeply committed to a strong and thriving honors program. To Miley Yee, Nelia Peralta, Judy Candel, and Vivian Bibi Sana for making sure that throughout the year that I know what I'm doing and meet all my deadlines, and especially for their meticulous help in organizing this festive event. So with all that, I'm going to hand it over to the students themselves. Each will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to take a Q&A for the whole panel, followed by lunch and the afternoon panel. So I welcome you throughout the day, and I know that you're going to enjoy these talks. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Lamb. So really quickly, I'd first like to thank my advisor, Professor Claire Jarvis, and my graduate mentor, Chelsea Davis, who's sitting back there, both without whom I could not have finished this project. Also thank you to Dr. Alice Stavely, who made this thesis and this entire colloquium possible. Finally, thank you to my second reader, Professor Mark McGurl, for taking the time to read my thesis. Thank you to everyone who took the time to come today, and especially my mom for flying from SoCal to come here. So thank you. So my thesis is titled Framing Marlowe, The Limits of Glamour and Obscurity in Joseph Conrad's Adventure Novellas. In my thesis, I explore Joseph Conrad's modernist critique of the glamour and obscurity of 19th century adventure narratives by examining the narrative frame structures of two of Conrad's novellas, Youth and Heart of Darkness. So both Youth and Heart of Darkness were published at the turn of the 20th century as the popularity of 19th century adventure fiction waned with the introduction of literary modernism. Conrad is considered an early modernist, but his works still contain elements of 19th century realism. So first I'll examine the context of Conrad's works by defining characteristics of 19th century adventure fiction and literary modernism. So first, the 19th century marked a literary era characterized by European adventure fiction, so from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island to H. Rider Haggard's Tales of Adventure in Exotic Places, pictured here is King Solomon's Mines. The popular genre of fiction fulfilled what literary critic Hayden Ward calls the young man's hunger for action and knowledge, for fighting and discovery, for the witchery of facts and the wild poetry of geography. So that fulfillment and the adventure narrative are primarily characterized and driven by plot. In Treasure Island, for instance, the narrator, Jim Hawkins, goes on a suspenseful adventure to find the hidden treasure of Captain Billy Bones, encounters conflict with the evil Long John Silver, and by the end of the story, he finds the treasure. Both Youth and Heart of Darkness trace the at-sea adventures of Conrad's narrator, Marlowe. So Conrad's critics often attempt to trace the relationship between Conrad's works and adventure fiction. According to literary critic John Peck, the most consistent feature in Conrad's works is a reliance upon the standard structure of a sea story. A sailor embarks upon a voyage. During the course of the voyage, he is tested, and the experience either makes or breaks him. A little later, I'll discuss how Conrad uses these elements of adventure fiction only to subvert them, which leads me to my definition of modernism. So the turn of the 20th century marked the beginning of literary modernism, with works from writers like William Faulkner and James Joyce that deviated from previously accepted literary norms. So these modernist texts took a turn away from the plot-driven 19th century novel, focusing instead on reworking traditional forms and themes. So characteristics of modernism could include disjointed narrative structure, stream of consciousness, which is what Joyce's works are primarily known for, or addressing the inner thoughts and psychological reality of characters. So in my thesis, I focus on where we can locate Conrad's modernism in his novellas, which straddle the line between the realist adventure and the modernist text. So there are two aspects of the 19th century adventure narrative that Conrad criticizes in his texts, and that's obscurity and glamour. So in my thesis, first, I define obscurity as vague language that elicits multiple meanings. So for instance, from this line in Treasure Island, Robert Louis Stevenson writes, "In all my fancies, nothing occurred to me so strange and tragic as our actual adventures." So while the narrator, Jim Hawkins, calls the adventure strange and tragic, he doesn't specify precisely what about the adventure is strange and tragic. So it could be Hawkins' encounter with an unknown environment, it could be the deaths he witnessed on the island, or it could be his physical struggles to escape entrapment by Long John Silver. By the end of the novel, these strange tragedies that Hawkins references never even materialize. Instead, Stevenson's characters end in a state of greater wealth than when the novel began. Hawkins finds the treasure, and even the deceptive Long John Silver escapes with money. So Stevenson seems to rely on obscurity to allude to this non-existent tragedy and mask the shallowness of the actual plot. And the relationship between obscurity and the shallowness of the adventure plot helps me define Conrad's criticism of the glamour of adventure. So in my definition of glamour, I draw upon Peter Bailey's conception of glamour in his book, Popular Culture and Performance in the Victorian City. Bailey defines the glamorous subject in two ways. So first, he writes that glamour exists in a cosmetic form. Second, he claims that the glamorous subject belongs to a fantasy world, idealized and distant. So he uses the adjective cosmetic to base glamour on physical appearance and beauty, and then he calls it idealized but distant. And in the same vein, I define the glamour of adventure as the idealization of adventure, as shown through the narrative's use of physical sensory details to evoke beauty or pleasure. So from Conrad's perspective, this distant idealization of adventure exists opposite to the harsher realities of adventure. So this passage from Treasure Island highlights the overabundance of sensory details that adventure writers tend to use to evoke glamour. So this is from Treasure Island, and he writes, "For the next little while the whole world swam away from before me in a whirling mist, silver and the birds and the hilltop going round and topsy-turvy before my eyes, and all manner of bells ringing and distant voices shouting in my ear." So every material object before Stevenson's narrator, you have the whole world, the birds, the hilltop, silver, all end in this clamor of distant sounds and voices, like bells ringing and distant voices shouting in my ear. So it seems that the material, physical nature of Hawkins' environment changes form and becomes distant and detached. So if glamour arises from the overload of sensory details in the passage, it's only because Stephen obscures those details by the end of the passage to make them more alluring. Later in my analysis of Heart of Darkness, I'll show how Conrad also uses voice and sounds to address and criticize how the adventure destabilizes material objects. So although I argue that Conrad criticizes the obscurity of the adventure narrative, multiple literary critics have actually credited Conrad's own obscurity as the source of his modernist experimentation. So for instance, you could take Kurtz's famous final lines from Heart of Darkness, the horror, which elicits a multiplicity of meanings. So that horror could refer to the horrors Kurtz witnessed in Africa. It could refer to Kurtz's personal realization of the horrors he committed, or according to critic Ivan Krailkamp, the lines could show awareness that language might function with no connection to its human source. So in her book, Granular Modernism, Becky Carver argues that Conrad purposely sustains techniques of irrelevance, plotlessness, miscellaneousness, convolution, and confusion in his texts because he has an impulse to reinvent literary convention, which is a characteristic of his modernist experimentation. But to support her argument, Carver assumes that the literary conventions before Conrad didn't sustain similarly obscure language and plots, which, as I've examined already, is not true. So what critics like Carver do not address is what I argue is the most significant source of Conrad's criticism of adventure, which is his novella's frame narrative structure, or in which Marlowe's adventure narrative exists within an outer narrative, or in other words, a story within a story. So both Youth and Heart of Darkness are structured so an unnamed narrator and a group of men listen to Marlowe's inner narrative in the framing outer narrative, while Marlowe tells them his adventure story, which is the inner narrative. So what critics refer to as Conrad's obscurity is actually Marlowe's obscurity. And it's within Marlowe's narrative that Conrad uses obscure language, but it is within the outer narrative that Conrad draws attention to that obscurity and the destabilization of the adventure narrative and narrator represented by the inner narrative and Marlowe. And Conrad alludes to the significance of the frame in Heart of Darkness when he writes, "The meaning of an episode was not inside like a kernel, but outside, enveloping the tale." So from this line, we can see that he seems to say that meaning rooted within Conrad's text is not inside, but outside, a reference to the significance of the outer narrative over the inner one. So first, in my analysis of youth, I look at how Conrad depicts the isolating effects of glamour and the sea, which is something that Marlowe exclaims at the end of the novella that distances himself from the other characters in the outer narrative. So in his narrative, Marlowe recalls his adventures at sea to the east as a young boy. At the beginning of the novella, Conrad establishes Marlowe as closely bonded to his listeners by their ties to England, to the sea, and to the same social class. But by the end of the novella, and as a result of Marlowe's adventure narrative, Marlowe ends isolated from that community. An important image and symbol in the novella is the bottle. So 5 times throughout his narrative, Marlowe interrupts the inner adventure narrative to refer back to the outer narrative by commanding his listeners to pass the bottle. But on the final page of the book, instead of Marlowe asking for the bottle, the unnamed narrator instead describes Marlowe's actions by saying, "He drank." So while Marlowe cries, "Youth and the sea, glamour and the sea," the unnamed narrator only responds by saying Marlowe drank, and he drank again. So the shift from Marlowe's imperative, "pass the bottle," which illustrates Marlowe's call for community, to the third-person narration of the unnamed narrator in the outer narrative, which illustrates the distance between Marlowe and his listeners, shows that over the course of Marlowe's own narrative, Marlowe's role within his community of listeners in the outer narrative disappears. And by the end of the novella, Marlowe is stuck recalling only a moment of his youth and the glamour and the sea, while the other characters in the outer narrative scrutinize him. So this line from the end of Youth further addresses that separation between Marlowe and his listeners. So the unnamed narrator recalls at the end of Youth, "And we all nodded at him, the man of finance, the man of accounts, the man of law. We all nodded at him over the polished table that, like a still sheet of brown water, reflected our faces, lined, wrinkled." So first, what the passage does is it physically separates the we, which are Marlowe's listeners and the unnamed narrator in the outer narrative, from Marlowe, which is the him. And then secondly, the only response that his listeners have for Marlowe's narrative is nodding at him in silence, which is an unusually curt response. And then finally, the unnamed narrator describes the polished table that reflected their faces, which ends the novella with a polished reflection that highlights the surface level or external qualities associated with Marlowe's narrative. So Marlowe's polished narrative, like the polished tables and faces, never seems to escape its surface level appeal. And in addition to Marlowe's physical isolation over the table from the rest of the characters, Conrad also isolates Marlowe mentally and emotionally. So while Marlowe remains stuck in the glamour and the illusions of his youth, he leaves the other characters in a state of unfulfilled, obscure desire. So their faces are lined and wrinkled, and in the final lines of the novella, Marlowe leaves the characters looking anxiously for something out of life. So next, in my analysis of Heart of Darkness, I show how Conrad uses Marlowe's obscurity and voice to limit Marlowe's own narrative. So this is an excerpt in which Marlowe addresses his listeners in the outer narrative. He asks them, "Do you see the story? Do you see anything? It seems to me I'm trying to tell you a dream, making a vain attempt because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation, that notion of being captured by the incredible, which is of the very essence of dreams." So in this passage, Marlowe exhibits awareness of the dreamlike nature of his own narrative. He acknowledges that it seems that he's trying to tell a dream, but he's making a vain attempt at doing so. And even more, Marlowe acknowledges that his narrative is not even like a dream, but a relation of a dream. So already a dream exists as an abstract version of reality because it's a product of the dreamer's mind and it represents immaterial ideas over concrete images. So when Marlowe claims that a story is like a relation of a dream, he adds another layer of abstraction to an already abstracted reality, a representation of how obscure the adventure narrative can be. And then Conrad uses the difference between a dream and attempting to tell someone outside of one's own mind about a dream to mirror the difference between Marlowe's actual adventure and attempting to tell someone who did not experience that adventure about it. So the darker details of Marlowe's adventure, such as the horror or darkness he attempts to communicate, cannot be fully duplicated. And then while Stevenson in Treasure Island uses a clamor of voices and sounds to evoke glamour, Conrad uses voice in Heart of Darkness to represent the dematerializing effects of Marlowe's adventure narrative. So in this passage, the unnamed narrator recalls, "It had become so pitch dark that we listeners could hardly see one another. For a long time already, Marlowe, sitting apart, had been no more to us than a voice." The passage draws readers' attention to Marlowe's physical presence in the outer narrative. He was sitting apart in pitch darkness, creating physical distance between Marlowe and the other characters, and visual obscurity of Marlowe's body. And then the unnamed narrator repeats his refrain that Marlowe is no more than a voice. So literary critic Hans Ulrich Sieber addresses the limits of voice by arguing that a person merely consisting of a voice does not meet the criteria of a full human being. So the description of Marlowe takes away from Marlowe's existence as a full human being. Instead, Marlowe operates as a voice separated from its human source. And then Sieber adds to his argument that it's the vocal surface itself which causes an effect, reiterating our perception of Marlowe's narrative as a surface-level depiction rather than a substantive, realistic version of adventure. So to sum up, in my thesis, I've examined moments of obscurity and glamour in Treasure Island to highlight which aspects of the 19th century adventure narrative that Conrad subverts in his own works. Then I credited Conrad's modernist experimentation not to his obscurity, but instead to the frame narrative structures of Youth and Heart of Darkness. So while Marlowe's inner adventure narratives draw upon or reference the obscurity and glamour of the 19th century adventure, readers do not take those elements at face value. Instead, we have access to the limits of glamour and obscurity in adventure narratives through the outer framing narratives of his novellas. Thank you.
I'll let everyone get settled first. Hello. My name is Zane Hellman. I'd first like to say thank you to my thesis advisor, Alex Wallach, my secondary reader, Professor Michelle Elam, and my graduate advisor, Gabriela Salvadea. I guess I'll just start. When the narrator of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man states, "When I discover who I am, I'll be free," he understood that there is a freedom in knowing yourself and your place in the world. Yet we are not simply concerned with our individual identity solely in regards to the self, but also in regard to others. Imbued in the question, who am I, is a second one, who am I not? We understand ourselves in relation to those that surround us. Charles Cooley asserts in his book, Human Nature and the Social Order, that society and individuals do not denote separable phenomenon, but are simply collected and distributive aspects of the same thing. Essentially, he claims that an understanding of the self is inherently a reflection of the society in which that self was created. It is not surprising then that in the United States, which has had a long history of racism and racial violence, particularly against black individuals, that the formation of a self-identity is deeply affected by one's physical characteristics and the racial treatment that comes with those characteristics. Although the field of racial identity formation extends beyond the black-white binary, the idea of African American racial identity and its formation is a topic that continues to garner attention and research. For the purposes of my talk, I will be focusing primarily on Danzy Senna's Caucasia and Emily Rabideau's The Professor's Daughter, both of which explore race and racial identity as central themes. Senna's Caucasia follows Birdie Lee, a character who, like Senna herself, is the daughter of a white mother and a black father, as she deals with the many problems that stem from her racial ambiguity. Within the text, Birdie's racial identity becomes instrumental in how the narrative progresses. The same is true for Emily Rabideau's The Professor's Daughter, which follows BJ, a black man who suffered through racism and family trauma throughout his childhood in Jim Crow, Louisiana, and his daughter Emma, who is biracial like Birdie. It's simply noticing that racial identities of characters are important within a narrative can be trivial. It did not necessarily deepen our understanding of the text specifically or literature in general. Comprehending how the racial identity is formed, maintained, and altered, on the other hand, provides insight into the relevance and the underlying dynamics of the given novel. In order to understand the how of racial identity formation, I initially chose to employ Alex Wallach's theories of character spaces and systems, which he outlines in his book, The One versus the Many, when looking at Senna's Caucasia. Wallach's attention to both a character's representation as an individual and also as an amount of verbal space taken up by that very same description allows him to track the unique ways in which the narrator provides characters with more or less space. He then uses this analysis to draw larger conclusions about the character system and therefore the social dynamics within that novel. However, Wallach only deals with realist novels from the 19th century told in third-person omniscient voices. His definition of a character space, though, as being the particular and charged encounter between an individual human personality and determined space and position within the narrative as a whole, opens onto other interesting questions when looking at racial identity formation, like what happens when one character is reflected or developed within another character's space? How can we address shared spaces where two characters occupy an equal footing within the discourse? To answer these questions, I propose two new types of character spaces, which I respectively call windowed and shared spaces. I see windowed character spaces as moments in the discourse that are specifically narrating a single character, usually minor, and at the same time revealing or shaping unique aspects of the central protagonist indirectly. I define shared character spaces, on the other hand, as spaces in which two characters equally share attention within the discourse. Typically, collective pronouns such as we or they allow for this sharing to occur because the pronouns briefly conjoin two characters into a single verbal entity that allows them to be described or act in a collective manner. A notable passage that demonstrates both of these things appears early on in Caucasia when Bertie goes with her father and her sister to Aunt Dot's party. Bertie describes the scene as she walks up to the door as follows. I saw she, Dot, wore high-heel white platforms and a tight, bright yellow mini dress. She smelled smoky, foreign already. As she wrapped Cole and me in her arms, she held us away from her then to examine us. If it isn't the terrible twosome, give your Annie a kiss. Look at you two, so grown. Hot damn, Cole, check you out. She spun Cole around in her arms and said to my father with a wink, watch out there, Big Daddy, she's gonna be a heartbreaker. Here, Bertie, the narrator, initially introduces Dot. From there, Dot merges Cole and me into an us entity with a hug, which he then holds at an arm's distance to examine. This is a prime example of a shared character space. The joining of Bertie and Cole into the entity of the terrible twosome is both a physical act through Dot's embrace and a spoken one. However, Dot separates the sisters by commenting on Cole's physical beauty and twirling her around as a way to distinguish Cole from Bertie, again, verbally and physically. This division between Bertie and Cole is made all the more apparent by the fact that Dot initially recognizes and embraces both before leaving Bertie off to the side to comment and center our attention on Bertie's older sister. Further, when Dot spotlights Cole's physical appearance, it tacitly asserts that Bertie herself is not worthy of attention from her aunt, thus developing Bertie's character through her exclusion from the discourse. This exclusion is a windowed space. The reader learns something about Bertie through the narrator detailing something of significance about Cole. While it's possible to read the interaction between Dot and the two children as being the interaction of three character spaces within the character system, there's something gained by noticing the interaction begins with three separate entities and then two spaces are combined only to be divided out again. This joining together and pulling apart of Bertie and Cole becomes one of the major ways that Bertie comes to define her own identity throughout the rest of the novel. That is, she recognizes which groups of people she is alike and shares space with, and which she is not alike and is separated from. With these two nuanced types of character spaces, the formation of the protagonist's identity is no longer simply confined to the interactions between an individual character space with the larger character system, but can also manifest in the areas of the discourse where the protagonist is referenced or developed indirectly through the actions of another, or shares centrality with a minor character. Further, the merging of two spaces into one reorganizes the character system in a way that adds fluidity to both character spaces and character system, and the character system as a whole within a given narrative. The instability of the system thus becomes indicative of the flexible nature of character spaces and the characters that fill them. Just as identities are shaped, altered, and molded by the society in which and with which they interact, so too are character spaces and character systems continually reimagined and altered based upon the narrative environment surrounding them. Beyond simply paying attention to character spaces in order to understand racial identity formation in literature, one has to also look at the role that the narrator plays in this process. Because racial identity is constructed out of subjective interpretations of physical markers on the human body, such as skin color, hair texture, and facial features, there are bound to be differences between first-person narration, which is always subjective, and third-person narration, which can use distance and a lack of interiority to separate the narrator from the characters in the discourse. Emily Rabideau's book, The Professor's Daughter, is the perfect novel for teasing out the differences between construction of racial identity in first and third-person narratives. The book shifts back and forth between two main narratives, Emma's narrative in the first person and BJ's in the third. These two distinct points of view are necessary for the specific stories that are shared. Emma's narrative arc mirrors Birdie's in Caucasia. There is an interior quest to stabilize her own liminal racial identity, and thus her narrative relies upon a very intimate first-person narrative voice. BJ's narrative, on the other hand, begins as an external racial battle where he must cope with the overt racism he encounters. In this case, the use of a distant third-person narrator allows for his racial identity to be shown through his interactions with minor characters surrounding him. Later on in his life, however, when his story shifts from dealing with external racism to focusing on an internal conflict born out of his past, the murder of his father, and his own alienation from his family, the third-person narration relies heavily on free and direct discourse and psychonarration to tease out nuanced feelings, thoughts, and ideas that become more essential to understanding BJ as an evolving individual. Together, these narratives not only allow for an in-depth look at how vital subjective narration is to the formation of racial identity in literature, but also the unique approaches that third-person narration can utilize in order to delineate the different interactions that can occur between a character and either an overtly racist society or one in which racial friction is much more subtle. For the purposes of succinctness, I will primarily focus on the shift in subjective narration within BJ's story, because the first-person point of view is indirectly touched upon within this analysis. Early on, while boarding a bus in Jim Crow, Louisiana, BJ comes face to face with the racist society in which he lives. Nan Zan and the boys, BJ and Uncle Lucius, boarded and were making their way down the aisle to the back when a little white boy in a straw hat stuck out his foot. BJ tripped, lost hold of the library book he had been carrying, and fell flat on his face. Several people snickered. There's nothing subtle about the racial implications of this scene. It is as black and white as racist interactions come. There's no need for the third-person narrator to use any form of subjective viewpoint to underscore why this minor character barged into the center of the discourse in order to harm the protagonist, or how this interaction and the following response from the other passengers might affect BJ psychologically. It is clear through just describing the action of the characters involved. Later on, however, after BJ has become a successful professor at Princeton, the reader begins to see the weight of subtle forms of racism and racial profiling that BJ continues to be subjected to within his own neighborhood. The professor had been mistaken for a gardener 4 times in the 4 years he had lived in Princeton, New Jersey. Twice by the same woman who'd welcomed him and his family with a box of macaroons on the day they moved in. He had worked as a gardener's assistant in his youth, and he wondered if they could smell it on him. The narrator initially recounts a seemingly innocuous recurring action in BJ's life in New Jersey, him being mistaken for a gardener. This small mistake, however, is heightened when the narrator reveals that the same person makes the mistake twice, even after welcoming BJ and his family to the neighborhood. In the following sentences, although the discourse says that he worries that it is a smell that is giving away his previous job as a gardener's assistant, in reality, the reader recognizes that it is skin color that solicits such remarks. The narrator underscores this with psychonarration, allowing for the reader to understand BJ's desire to not have his racial identity affect his interactions with others. Ultimately, it is these small slights and racial prejudices that seem to be the seeds for many of BJ's own internal dialogues throughout the remaining narrative. The third-person perspective in BJ's narrative attempts to emulate the nuance of identity in both Birdie's and Emma's respective narrative arcs when it metaphorically closes the distance and shifts the discourse from an objective lens seen in BJ's childhood to an internal subjective one to describe events later in BJ's life. More overt interactions, like those seen early on, do not require subjective language, such as psychonarration and free and direct discourse, to demonstrate how these events might affect BJ. The reader is able to intuit the effects. Yet when confronted with racial prejudices and slights, BJ's interiority becomes much more important for the progression of the plot. Essentially, more overt forms of racism require less character space and insight into a character's mind to reveal the consequences of an action, while less overt racial tensions and slights require far more nuance and therefore more space and interiority to reveal how a character is affected. These differing approaches to varied levels of racism also demonstrate that overt racism is implied to always have the same ramification in the book, regardless of the character it is directed towards, hence the lack of interiority shown by the narrator. However, more subtle forms of racism, like racial profiling, have consequences that are dependent upon the internal emotional state of the character at a given point in time. This variation between characters in response to less overt racial interactions allows for responses to be specific scenarios that are idiosyncratically exclusive and makes each character appear more real. Although Caucasia depicts a fair amount of overt racism, rarely is this racist fervor directed towards Birdie alone. Rather, other characters are treated in overtly racist ways, which can be narrated and portrayed from Birdie's distant, second-person-esque point of view, with no need to enter those characters' psyche. These instances of racism in which Birdie is the bystander, combined with the more subtle forms of racism she experiences, becomes the basis for much of Birdie's own personal sense of racial identity. It is this identity which is continuously shifting in response to the different environments through which Birdie moves and with which she interacts, that determines much of the way Birdie responds to racial tension and friction as the novel progresses. Essentially, Birdie's identity can be seen as a cumulative sum of her experiences with and response to the racial milieu that is constantly changing around her. The same can be said of BJ throughout The Professor's Daughter, the only difference being that his story happens to be shaped early on by overtly racist acts directed towards him, which continue to haunt him throughout the remainder of his story. In summary, both books necessitate specific modes of literary analysis, defining and charting windowed and shared character spaces in Caucasia, and attention to narrative distance in The Professor's Daughter. Work done with Caucasia led to an understanding of the formation of racial identity, one born out of the social environments that surround a given character, while The Professor's Daughter provided insight into the importance of the narratorial point of view, as well as the relative distance of the third-person narrator when elucidating a protagonist's internal racial identity. Beyond these findings, the analysis of these two novels in proximity to each other allows for the differing methodologies to then be applied to the adjacent book. Through this cross-application of techniques, of methodologies, larger conclusions can be drawn about the narrative techniques necessary for the formation of racial identities in literature. For these two books and for many others, the consequences that come from subtle forms of racism is dependent upon the internal racial identity of a given character, an identity which is continuously being altered and molded by the ever-changing social environment around them. Further, the portrayal of these nuanced racial identities relies upon providing access to internal dialogues of specific characters and outlining the social environments that is affecting those internal identities. All of it together not only allows the reader to gain an appreciation for an protagonist's racial identity, but also affords the narrator the tools necessary to create characters who can discover who they are and be free. Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Hannah Grace, and I wrote my thesis about patterns of thought in W.H. Auden's poetry about the natural world. Before I begin, I would like to thank my advisor, Professor Jenkins, Mary Kim, my graduate mentor, and Roland Green, my second reader, and of course, Dr. Stavely. Thanks also to my mom for coming from Boston. So I'm first going to give you a little bit of background about Auden, and then I'm going to discuss the poems I wrote about, the way I analyzed these poems, and the conclusions I've drawn. Finally, I will give an example of the conclusion I've made in this thesis by highlighting similarities and differences in two of Auden's poems. W.H. Auden was born in Britain in 1907. He grew up in Birmingham, but as a child, he spent a lot of time in the small mining village of Raithup, where he spent time wandering the abandoned lead mines. Auden moved to the United States in 1939 and traveled extremely frequently throughout the rest of his life. He has a large body of work that includes poetry, essays, and travel books. Typically, Auden is known for his reason and wit. According to the Poetry Foundation, some critics have gone as far as to call his work unromantic. He is often portrayed in critical work as being urbane and metropolitan, a well-traveled and rational man who discusses lofty ideas in carefully considered formal poetry. For the purpose of this thesis, I limited the work I analyzed to Auden's poems that concern the natural world. Typically, Auden is not considered a nature poet. When critics describe his work, the words academic, urbane, and formal come to mind, but Auden's poetry about nature is largely neglected as a general topic in critical work. However, I wanted to focus on Auden's poetry about nature because, on a personal level, his descriptions about the natural world in poems such as In Praise of Limestone were what drew me to his poetry initially. Therefore, in the 13 poems I analyzed in this thesis, I found poems about nature that span from the early days of his writing career in the 1920s to some of his latest poems in the 60s. The poems I analyzed in this thesis typically do not appear side by side. Because Auden's poetry is typically anthologized chronologically, his work about the natural world that spans the entirety of his poetic career would not appear together. What intrigued me about the body of work I studied for this project was that these poems, which would not normally appear side by side, shed new light on one another simply by their proximity. In this thesis, I wanted to take a look at an unexpected topic in Auden's work and analyze it in a new manner. Two prominent Auden critics, Edward Mendelsohn and John Fuller, read Auden in two distinct ways. While Mendelsohn examines Auden's work in a wider scope, looking at the bigger picture, Fuller looks at the smallest details, allusions, and references in his poetry, examining closely every word. In my own analysis of Auden, I combine these methods, attempting to look at the big picture through the small details. So now I'll read Auden's poem, Who Stands the Crux Left of the Watershed, and give an example of this type of analysis. Who stands the crux left of the watershed, on the wet road between the chafing grass? Below him sees dismantled washing floors, snatches of tram line running to the wood, an industry already comatose yet sparsely living. A ramshackle engine at Cashwell raises water. For 10 years it lay in flooded workings until this, its latter office, grudgingly performed, and further here and there, though many dead lie under the poor soil, some acts are chosen, taken from recent winters. Two there were, cleaned out a damaged shaft by hand, clutching the winch the gale would tear them from. One died during a storm, the fells impassable, not at his village, but in wooden shape. Through long abandoned levels, nosed his way, and in his final valley went to ground. Go home now, stranger, proud of your young stock. Stranger, turn back, frustrate and vexed. This land, cut off, will not communicate. Be no accessory, content to one, aimless for faces rather there than here. Beams from your car may cross a bedroom wall, they wake no sleeper. You may hear the wind arriving driven from the ignorant sea to hurt itself on pane, on bark of elm, where sap unbaffled rises. Being spring, but seldom this. Near you, taller than grass, ears poised before decision, scenting danger. So in this poem, Auden's use of technical mining language, such as washing floor, tram line, and winch, all make the reader into the stranger to whom the poem is addressed in the second stanza. In the larger argument, I make the distinction between Auden's writing about familiar and unfamiliar places. In writing about familiar places, Auden uses the authority of this technical mining language as an occasion for his poetry. These small details work to reinforce a greater idea that authority over a place allows a poet to write about it confidently and frequently. This method of extrapolating the small details to make larger inferences about Auden's work at large combines these two existing critical methods. What also interested me about this particular set of poems was how Auden keeps returning to certain ideas about the natural world throughout his poetic career. I divided the poems I studied into three groups: poems about the lead mines and the mining town, poems that concern landscape and the body, and poems about unfamiliar places. The mines that Auden visited as a child are crucial to the ideas behind this thesis because the mine represents an invasion of nature for the purpose of taking lead. If we consider the lead mine as a natural space, we also come to the conclusion that the act of mining is meaningful to Auden, who keeps returning to these mines as an occasion for his poetry in both his juvenilia and in his last year's writing. These mines are important for understanding Auden's writing, therefore, because they are not only a recurring pattern, but also a way of reading his poetry. To better understand Auden, we too must extract meaning from these unexpected places, not taking poems at face value, but digging deeper for unexpected meaning. Regarding the human body and landscape, I explore the idea that when Auden writes about landscape and the human body, he no longer fits the mold of the academic, urbane poet, and instead uses the natural world to access more emotional subjects. While images of the sun, the moon, and the countryside are abundant in modern English poetry, the human body is a harder topic to discuss. Through my analysis of these poems, I demonstrate how depicting different types of nature gives Auden access to the more sensitive and taboo topic of the human body. From there, a general pattern emerges. Auden discusses nature, shifts the poem towards some reference to the body, and ultimately ends up at a conclusion to the poem which would be completely unexpected from the start, a surprising turn from the conventional, unemotional beginning of the poem. This pattern gives the impression that the poet tries to contain his insecurities, but they burst out at the end of the poem regardless. I also write about Auden's poetry about places unknown to him in the natural world, whether he imagines these places or travels to them himself. While Auden writes from a place of authority in Who Stands the Crux Left of the Watershed, in these poems about unfamiliar places, Auden himself becomes the stranger. I first assert that Auden's writing about strange or unknown places contains an inherent loneliness and desolation. I also discuss how Auden's dichotomy between rural and urban places leads to the characterization of the city as evil and the countryside as pure and good, but removed from everyday life. Again, Auden returns to champion the rural, even over the urban for which he is typically known. Auden's inconsistencies in his writing are just important as his changes and developments, particularly the way that Auden looks at nature throughout his poetic career demonstrates that there is value in a poet milling over the same topics and ideas throughout his entire life. In addition, these conclusions challenge the common conception of Auden as a metropolitan poet of rational ideas. Auden, too, has an appreciation for the rural and writes with emotion, insecurity, and anxiety. Whether overtly or beneath the surface, the speaker of his poems constantly worries about death, irrelevance, and change. The natural world gives Auden a place to showcase these anxieties because he can talk around the subject. Though Auden may begin with a description of a place, latent anxieties emerge throughout the poem. Through the metaphor of Auden's poetry about the mines, the winding path Auden takes to express his neuroses, and the way in which Auden treats the known against the unknown, a reader of Auden's nature poetry can see that the poet loves to circulate the same ideas in the same spaces over and over again. These ideas, throughout the entirety of Auden's poetic career, are comprised of concerns about whatever occupies his mind, and these concerns too stay reliable. This assertion is also significant because it contradicts many common conceptions of Auden. Many critics will argue that Auden's earlier and later works are so different that they should be separated in two different volumes. But this analysis argues for a different way of categorizing Auden's poetry. Instead of the traditional chronological way of organization, readers instead should consider Auden's poems for their content and thematic elements. To illustrate how I come to this conclusion, I will read another poem, much less known in Auden's canon than this one, Who Stands the Crux Left of the Watershed. This poem is called Amor Loci, which means love of a place in Latin, and it was written in 1965, while this one was written in 1927. Amor Loci. I could draw its map by heart, showing its contours, strata, and vegetation, name every height, small burn, and lonely shieling, but nameless to me, faceless as heather or grouse, are those who live there. It's dead, too vague for judgment, tangible only what they wrought, their giant works of delve and drainage in days preterite. Long since their hammering stopped as the loads all petered out in the Jew limestone. Here and there, a tough chimney still towers over dejected masonry, moss, decomposed machines, but with no one about, no chance of buttering bread, a land postured in my time for marginal farms. Any musical future is most unlikely. Industry wants cheap power, romantic muscle, a perilous wilderness. Mr. Pleasure pays for surf riding, claret, sex. It offers them none. To me, though, much. A vision, not, as perhaps at 12 I thought it, of Eden, still less of a New Jerusalem, but, for one, convinced he will die, more comely, more credible than either daydream. How, but with some real focus of desolation, could I, by analogy, imagine a love that, however often smeared, shrugged at, abandoned by a frivolous worldling, does not abandon? In comparing this poem to Who Stands the Crux Left of the Watershed, we must first note that the poems are about the same topic. The abandoned mining landscape still occupies Auden's mind 40 years later. Like in Who Stands, Auden uses local vernacular, like shieling, which means a small hut, and Jew limestone, which, while jarring to modern ears, refers to the deepest, most fundamental layer through which one cannot dig any deeper. The forms of these two poems are also completely different. While Who Stands is densely packed with meaning, Amor Loci gives the reader more room to breathe and digest what the poet says. Even though these poems seem formally and stylistically different, they both still feature these lead mines and the speaker's anxieties that stem from exploration of this place. In Who Stands, the speaker is concerned that no one will understand the lead mines as he does, and that the small mining village will be infiltrated by such strangers. In Amor Loci, the speaker explores his own love of these abandoned mines. He ends the poem on an overtly emotional note, where he expresses the desire that someone will love him as fully and unconditionally as he loves these mines. Both poems, therefore, use a description of the mines to trigger the speaker's latent anxieties. So while the poems at first appear different, they both express different insecurities that are rooted in the same image about the natural world. Therefore, in conclusion, I want to emphasize a few facets of Auden's work. First of all, while many critics emphasize what changes in Auden's work, I think that a greater understanding of Auden comes about when we consider also what stays the same. In this capacity, then, I examine nature poetry because it is not given as much critical attention as Auden's other work, and it comprises a group of poems that are both early and late in his career, both canonized and not canonized. When I examine Auden's poetry about the natural world, I find that these poems in particular bring out the parts of Auden that are not the urbane, metropolitan, academic poet whom critics describe. Instead, these poems bring out a more emotional, rural Auden, one who keeps ruminating on the natural world in order to write more fruitful and thoughtful poetry. Thank you.
Is it just the forward button? That's it. Great. I'll hang out for a bit. I guess not. Is the mic good? Awesome. Okay. All right, I guess I'll get started. My name is Amelia Schreier, and my thesis is titled Unhousing in Marilynne Robinson's novel Housekeeping. I would not have been able to complete this thesis without the guidance and support of my advisor, Professor Sian Nye, my second reader and the director of the honors program, Dr. Alice Stavely, and my graduate mentor, Hannah Smith-Drellick. Where'd she go? There she is. I would also like to thank my parents, today represented by my father, for putting up with me, supporting me, and loving me throughout the writing of this thesis, despite its ups and downs.
I first encountered the novel Housekeeping 2 years ago in one of my English core classes. The novel, published in 1980, tells the story of Ruth, the narrator, and her sister Lucille growing up in their ancestral home. Because their mother has died, Ruth and Lucille are raised by their grandmother and then by their Aunt Sylvie, a free-spirited woman who forever changes the lives of her nieces. Due to the nature of the course, we spent 3 classes discussing the novel, and I wrote a short paper on the function of the house. Typically, this would mark the end of my academic interaction with a book, but I couldn't get housekeeping out of my mind. Though Ruth is deceptively quiet and the plot deceivingly simple, I felt distinctly that Marilynne Robinson was attempting, and perhaps achieving, something significant through her book. The house, it seemed, still had secrets left to tell. Writing an honors thesis provided the perfect avenue through which to uncover these secrets. My research for the thesis led me to visit Robinson's archive at the Yale Beinecke Library. Her papers allowed me to see drafts of the text that often varied widely from the finished product. I could track the choices Robinson made to ultimately create the house and the characters who live there. I also saw the deeply personal side of writing a book. While some drafts were neatly typed, almost finished manuscripts, others were messier, crossed-out notebook pages. Still others looked like this. In 1980, Robinson was a full-time housewife, concerned with the care and upbringing of her 2 young sons. Novel writing was a secondary pursuit, and her journals and letters often lamented the slow progress of her story, which necessarily took a back seat to the duties of motherhood. This struggle in finding the balance between housewife and writer is literally visible on the page of her drafts. I was reminded by these crayon-covered drafts of other women who have written about the struggle between motherhood and writing, or more generally, between traditional gender roles and independence. Gloria Steinem's most recent book, My Life on the Road, describes her own lifelong journey to finding some balance between the safety of home and the freedom of travel. Why did she feel the need to make a choice? Why had these options become such polarized binaries? We might turn to Betty Friedan for further illumination. In 1963, Friedan wrote about the dissatisfaction that so many housewives of her generation felt in The Feminine Mystique. To hastily summarize, Friedan discovered that middle and upper middle class housewives often felt unfulfilled in their daily lives, despite being told by their upbringing and society at large that being a mother and keeping house would lead them to happiness. Friedan's solution to this problem was for the housewife to find a creative outlet, one that took her out of the house, because otherwise she might always be interrupted. This concern of interruption calls to mind one of Friedan's famous progenitors, Virginia Woolf, who also wrote of a woman's need to find a room of one's own. In her treatise, Woolf reminds us of famous female novelists like George Eliot, the Bronte sisters, and Jane Austen, who wrote their novels in the shared space of the sitting room, and points out that each of them, in their own way, wrote about the life of the house. In fact, female novelists have been writing about the house for centuries. One of the most famous Gothic novelists, Anne Radcliffe, wrote during the 1700s. Just as feminists like Friedan and Woolf use their writing abilities to protest the situation of the woman stuck in the house, female Gothic writers wrote from within the home about the dangers of barring women from the outside world. In this way, Gothic novelists pushed back against the idea that women belonged in the home and only in the home. In Housekeeping, Robinson borrows from this historical context and creates a new American Gothic. The novel revolves around a house that at first provides safety and security for its female inhabitants, but ultimately becomes a perilous prison. The house is also, in a sense, populated by ghosts. Ruth's grandfather dies by driving a train into the lake, an action echoed by Ruth's mother, Helen, in her suicide years later. The memory of these missing family members haunts Ruth throughout the novel. Built to be a sanctuary from the outside world, the house instead becomes a place of inescapable trauma. In adopting the genre of the Gothic and subverting these concepts of the traditional house, Robinson joins a long line of female writers who have asked, how do we break the tie between the woman and the house? How do we divorce femininity from domesticity? And how can we do it through writing? In order to subvert traditional ideas of domesticity, Robinson first presents them through the foundations of the house in the novel. Ruth's grandfather builds the house to be a safe haven for his family, but specifically a safe haven for his wife. On the very first page of the book, Ruth tells us, "Through all these generations of elders, we lived in one house, my grandmother's house, built for me by my grandfather." To preserve this safe haven, the house is built to be isolated. Housekeeping is set in the fictional town of Fingerbone, Idaho, which was inspired by the real town of Sandpoint, Idaho. Like its factual counterpart, Fingerbone is a tiny town dwarfed by the looming presence of an ancient lake, which floods yearly. So Ruth's grandfather built his house on a small hill away from both the town and the lake. Safe from the reaches of the lake, the house is also removed from the influences of the town. Ruth tells us, "Our whole family was standoffish. That we were self-sufficient, our house reminded us always." At first glance, this isolation works for the family. The house is described as a domestic paradise. Years pass simply and serenely, and even the death of the grandfather does little to disturb the peace. Traditional understandings of domesticity assign the woman to the internal life of the home and the man to the public life of the outside world, so the death of the only male member of the family removes their access to the outside world. The novel tells us, "With him gone, they were cut free from the troublesome possibilities of success, recognition, advancement. They had no reason to look forward, nothing to regret. Their lives spun off the tilting world like thread off a spindle. Breakfast time, supper time, lilac time, apple time." His death seems only to increase the safety and privacy of the house, because without him, the female members of the house are released from the worries of the public world. Free from the demands of success and advancement, Mrs. Foster and her 3 daughters seem to fall away from the course of history and time. Their life becomes an endless, dependable routine. In keeping with the Gothic tradition, however, all is not right in this domestic paradise. Built to be a private home, the house in actuality is neither safe nor isolated. Despite its geographic elevation, the house does fall victim to a terrible flood. In this flood, the water poured over the thresholds and covered the floor, forcing Sylvie and the girls to vacate the first floor, and it destabilizes the entire structure. As Ruth describes, the house flowed around us. The invasion of the lake also threatens the safety of the house by welcoming in ghosts. If you recall, both Ruth's grandfather and mother perished in the lake, and through its waters she feels their presence tangibly in the house. This feeling of loss is compounded with an inherent sorrow that resides in the house. As Ruth says, "Every soul is put out of house." Even members of the family that don't die must leave because the house, as the only place for women, becomes only a place for women. Those who choose to marry or otherwise enter the public world must necessarily quit the house. No matter how stable, safe, and private the house may seem, it is impermanent. Though its walls and histories remain, its inhabitants do not. The perceived stability of the house is ultimately a state of permanent impermanence. Children are forever leaving, and no amount of isolation or stability can prevent it. Ruth's free-spirited aunt, Sylvie, understands that the only way to combat this trauma and grief is to break the boundaries of the house, undo its walls and the limits that create it. So Sylvie's form of housekeeping is to fling open the doors to nature and remove the distinction between internal and external. Ruth comes to a similar understanding halfway through the novel. One night, Ruth and her sister Lucille camp on the banks of the lake, building a makeshift shelter in which to spend the night. Halfway through the night, she wakes up and realizes that her sister is also awake. She, in this case, is Lucille, because Ruth is the narrator. So, "She sat down beside me in our ruined stronghold, never still, never accepting that all our human boundaries were overrun." Lucille would tell this story differently. She would say I fell asleep, but I did not. I simply let the darkness in the sky become coextensive with the darkness in my skull and bowels and bones. In this pseudo-house, Ruth adopts Sylvie's policy of breaking boundaries. Lucille, however, does not, and this moment in the novel becomes a point of divergence between the two sisters. Whereas Ruth becomes more and more like her free-spirited aunt, Lucille clings all the more to order and tradition, eventually bringing the sheriff of the town to intervene. In this moment of discovery, Marilynne Robinson sets Ruth on the path of the artist figure. As narrator of the story, she describes the problems of the house, but from this position of storyteller, she can also create. And through Ruth, Robinson creates a new concept of domesticity by undoing the house. A new theory of domesticity arises out of Ruth's attempts to supersede the trauma of loss, which continues to plague her through in the house. One particularly traumatic morning, after Ruth again sees the ghost of her mother around corners, but always out of reach, Ruth decries her own humanity and asks of the ghosts, "Let them come unhouse me of this flesh, and pry this house apart. It was no shelter now, it only kept me here alone, and I would rather be with them, if only to see them." She begins to describe herself as a house, and then breaks down that house. Moments like this continue to occur until the last night in the story, where Ruth is finally undone, and she unmakes the house inside her. She lets the cold, like the darkness, overrun her human boundaries, and by the end of the scene, the narration of the story refers to a third-person, reborn spirit Ruth. Having undone the house within her, Ruth has removed her ties to the physical house of the family and can now destroy its structure. Ruth describes her spirit self breaking out the windows and knocking down the doors, as she describes her own tomb. This imagined destruction is complemented by an actual demolition, for in escaping the house, the trauma that resides within, and the town that would keep them there, Ruth and Sylvie burn the house. "For we had to leave. I could not stay, and Sylvie would not stay without me. Now truly we were cast out to wander, and there was an end to housekeeping." The spirit Ruth has no need for the house, having destroyed the house within her, and so Ruth and Sylvie are free to leave. They adopt a life of transience, and the constant movement of this lifestyle entirely negates the need to keep house. Through Lucille, the novel presents the consequences of maintaining the house. Ruth imagines Lucille's future and where she might end up, but no matter where she goes, Boston for example, it seems that Lucille has not escaped her pain. We are nowhere in Boston. However Lucille may look, she will never find us there, or any trace or sign. We pause nowhere in Boston, and the perimeters of our wanderings are nowhere. No one watching this woman could know how her thoughts are thronged by our absence, or how she does not watch, does not listen, does not wait, does not hope, and always for me and Sylvie. Ruth and Sylvie, as transients, have no boundaries and no perimeters, but Lucille still suffers from the loss created and maintained by domesticity's strong walls. Through housekeeping, Robinson presents freedom of movement as the solution to the problem of the woman stuck in the house. In order to undo the idea that women are inherently domestic and belong in the house, she posits a new theory of home that requires no physical home at all. But does her solution finally solve the problem? Through Ruth and Lucille, Robinson presents two radical reactions to the same issue, but they sound like the two extremes that Steinem wrote about just last year in My Life on the Road. Neither extreme is ideal. Lucille suffers because she is plagued by the loss of the house, but Ruth is now barred from it. In choosing transience, she has rejected the life of the home, including its benefits. Perhaps then, Robinson displays the two in an effort to lead us to the middle ground that Steinem discovered later in her life. She describes this middle ground in My Life on the Road. "Now that being on the road was my choice, not my fate, I lost the melancholy feeling of everybody has a home but me. Instead of either or, I discovered a whole new world of and." Steinem ends her book with a direct message to the reader, a call to personal action. Because my father did not have to trade dying alone for the joys of the road. My mother did not have to give up a journey of her own to have a home. Neither do I. Neither do you. Because of the women who came before us, the 21st century woman has the task and the privilege of defining her own role. With a freedom not available in the past, she can choose the safety of home or the adventure of travel, or even both. And it is this grand message that Robinson works towards in her subtle, beautiful novel. Thank you.
Is this on? I wanted to thank you all for such enlivening and strangely interconnected papers. I didn't know when I gave the title of the panel about frames that you would actually all so clearly be talking about frameworks and thresholds, liminal spaces, and the struggle of various types of identities and narrative forms throughout those. So I'm hoping that that has engendered some observations or questions, and I'm happy to open up the floor to questions. So I will pass the mic over. Yes. Yeah.
Amelia, do you think the name she chose meant something? Ruth is a biblical story, and Sylvia is into the woods. So, is there any connections?
I have a mic still on. I absolutely do think so, that especially the biblical connections. Marilynne Robinson is deeply spiritual and very religious. And Christian themes do appear in the novel very subtly, and I think the name choices are one of those ways.
Okay, thanks for those papers. I guess I was struck by how each of you seems to be positioning like art or literature against kind of mainstream values, whether that's like the adventure tale or just like racial understanding or the house or like just industrial transformations that were rocking Britain when Auden was writing. So I guess a question would be, do you think the kind of critique literature can offer to mainstream life is specific to the writers you're working on, or maybe another version of this question would be, do the writers in any way kind of get entangled with or reproduce kind of some of the troubling trends that we see in mainstream life? This is sort of directed to everybody, so respond however you like.
Someone want to go first?
Yeah, I think especially with Conrad, he definitely applies a lot of elements of I guess what you consider the mainstream at the time, which was elements of adventure. And I think, yes, he does subvert and criticize them, but obviously he also incorporates those elements into his works. So I guess I don't think it's specific, I guess, since you've mentioned that all of us have, addressed the fact that they do subvert some sort of mainstream. But I think that in order to subvert the mainstream, you have to use or address elements of the mainstream in your works.
So I actually kind of started out my thesis kind of looking for stereotypes, particularly within literature. I thought that Alice Wallach's theory of minoring of characters would be particularly notable in stories where there is reliance on stereotypes. But as I move through these very contemporary narratives, I think both are written after the 90s and in the early 2000s, I noticed that there is almost these new narrative techniques that these authors were developing to talk about these very nuanced racial identities in their literature. So that's kind of, I guess, I'm not necessarily positing that it's against the mainstream, but kind of trying to forge a new path that gets out of that mainstream.
One of the poems I talked about in my thesis is called Moon Landing, and it was written basically right after the man first landed on the moon. And it's this poem that Auden writes that is kind of basically inherently skeptical of the moon landing. And you think everybody at this time is pumped about the moon landing. Everybody was writing about it and watching it on TV. And meanwhile, Auden has kind of this latent bitterness about the moon landing, where he's saying what does this do to nature? It's this invasion of this idea of the moon that he had been perfectly content to just write about and have be this romanticized symbol. So I think that absolutely a part of looking at literature is subverting the mainstream and bringing those smaller ideas to light.
I don't know how to go. I certainly place Marilynne Robinson in a tradition of women writers who write against the cult of domesticity and this concept of separate spheres that I didn't get to fully go into. So I think that she's one of many despite the fact that she might not feel the same. I see her writing as folding very nicely into a moment in second wave feminism where women are finally being able to enter a working world, and then having to debate the question of how do you balance that with being a mother and a woman and a wife. So yeah, I certainly see that she's part of a tradition.
This is another, I think, very broad question for all of the panelists. The kind of framing of the panel has to do with space, and all of your arguments turned on ideas of literary space or actual space or kind of metaphorical space in different ways. But it struck me as I was listening to the papers that they all could also be seen in terms of time and temporality in different ways. So I was just wondering if this kind of space and time axis had occurred to you when you were working on the projects, and if you had any thoughts about the implications of your arguments for the ways we think about these texts' configuration of time, both their own sort of narrative time and then larger ideas about time that might exist in culture.
Absolutely. I initially planned on including an entire chapter in my thesis about time and temporality in the novel Housekeeping. And if I were writing a dissertation, that would be the next move. I just ran out of space. But yeah, I had thought about time as sort of another unbounded space in the novel. I don't know if you've read the text, but it's great. And one of the greatest things about Housekeeping is that I know when it takes place because there are external hints. There are scraps of newspapers that pop up in the house. But other than that, Fingerbone as a town exists kind of apart from the rest of the world. And this has both positive and negative consequences. So I was very interested in time in the novel. I just didn't get a chance to look into it.
One thing that I wrote about and thought about a lot in terms of space and time was the idea of coming back to the same space at different points in time. So it's totally different to write about the place that you're currently at rather than coming back to that place 40 years later and reflecting on what that means. And I think that it was something that Auden did a lot in his writing career, to kind of circle back and go back to the same place in different points in time. And I think that you can definitely see that it's partly the same because it's in the same space, but you also reflect on a space so differently when you come back to it at different points in time.
Yeah, I think that question in particular is particularly astute for what I was talking about in terms of racial identity. There's a concept posited by many theorists in social psychology about the idea of salience of racial identity, which is how important is your identity to you at given points in time. And that changes as you move through different spaces, but also as you move throughout your life. When you're 13, your racial identity might not be as important to you as it is when you're 25. And it might be more important in a room full of white people than in a room full of black people. And so this kind of idea occurs throughout the books on a very minute level in terms of the different spaces and the different times that we see the characters moving through. But then it also occurs is particularly in The Professor's Daughter with BJ. You see him moving from the racial South, Jim Crow, like overt racism, and you see the progression of the society around him, but he doesn't necessarily lose all of those memories that occurred with in his childhood, and so those kind of follow him. So as time progresses, you see this weird kind of interaction between the society that is changing and him not necessarily fully changing or adapting to these new times.
Yeah, I think that there's actually like a completely direct correlation between narrative space within Conrad's novellas with a frame structure and temporally just in between the popularity of 19th century adventure fiction moving into early modernism, especially because Conrad started publishing his works around a time when English imperialism was getting extremely popular. So this idea of this like glamorous adventure is now turning into this idea of like Europeans taking over Africa and like colonizing and doing all these kind of terrible things. So I think narratively, like the inner narrative, so Marlowe's inner narrative, connects directly to the popular 19th century adventure narrative. So that correlation between the space that his narrative takes up within the novella and the time that it connects to, I think they're just completely correlated. And in the same vein, the criticism and the modernism of the outer narrative connects to Conrad's early modernism, like within that time frame.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. They were great. So all of you spent time focusing on one writer, I know in Zane's case, more than one. And I'm curious, if you had the opportunity to ask the writer that you've been studying for a year a question, what would you ask?
The ghost of Conrad.
Well, I guess for me, just because he is so obscure, so there are a lot of different moments in his text that, like I've said, elicit multiple meanings. So I guess I would ask him if there was a specific meaning for certain things, like if the horror did refer to one thing that he did think of in his mind, or if he was purposely just being vague and obscure to kind of, support the argument in my thesis. But that's probably what I'd ask him.
Yeah, so both of the authors that I studied are both biracial. I believe both of them have black fathers and white mothers. And I wanted to ask them how much of their personal identity was imbued in the characters that they wrote. Because I think that's really interesting in terms of whether these characters are completely fictionalized or whether the feelings and the emotions that seem so rich and so real in these texts come from everyday interactions that they themselves have experienced.
So one thing that was interesting to me in writing about Auden was the fact that I wrote a lot about him coming back to the same places and the same ideas, but in his own life, he traveled extensively and was a very, very well-traveled person, went to many, many different countries, and was traveling for a large part of his adult life. And I think that I would ask him maybe why he comes back to these same places so much when throughout his life he has the opportunity to travel but is always going to different places.
Thanks to the amazingness of Stanford, I actually got the chance to meet my author because she came and spoke last October. So I did ask her. I asked her two questions. Because her Housekeeping was published in 1980, so it's been some time. She's still living, she's still writing. And she has a trilogy that she's been working on, and the last episode of that was published in, I think, 2012. And in interviews, she speaks mainly about that trilogy and about her essays. She doesn't seem to come back to Housekeeping very often. And I asked her why that is, and if she no longer feels a connection to the characters in the text, or if they're still there for her. And I think her answer had to do with the fact that she actually grew up in Sandpoint, Idaho, and so it's a very personal novel. She certainly imbues part of herself into the character of Ruth, but also makes a concerted effort to differentiate herself from the character. And I think that she's become unhappy with how often people conflate the character and the author, which might be part of the reason why she doesn't talk about it so much anymore. So I got to ask my questions, but if I had one more question to ask, I think I'd ask her what she thinks of my thesis, because she's she's notoriously against criticism, literary criticism entirely. She doesn't think it should be analyzed, so I don't know. I'd want to know if she would be offended or not. Yeah.
I had a question for Hannah. I was just, well, I think a few of us would have a problem with this sort of opposition between academics and romanticism or emotion. But I guess in regards to Auden, I had this, I wanted to ask you how, whether these poems themselves are, or like what's academic about those? I'm thinking of the watershed, it's sort of antiquarian meter, like he's reviving this odd alliterative, like using almost medical diction like comatose. So in other words, if you're talking about continuities, is there a continuity between the urban and the sort of more nature-obsessed Aden?
Thank you. So I think that's a really good question, because there is definitely kind of a continuity between the rural Aden and the urban Aden. I think that when I kind of talk about the difference between sort of like the academic and the emotional, it's kind of a stylistic thing, whereas we'll talk about things that kind of sound more essayistic and are meant to kind of stimulate the cerebral rather than poems that are supposed to make you feel. And I think that what I found in writing my thesis was that there was definitely a continuity between the kind of urbane Aden and those kind of like high lofty ideals about reason and wit, and the rural Aden and more of a sentimentality. If that answers your question.
You guys are making me run. There you go.
Thank you so much for your presentations. They were all so great. My question is for Zane and Amelia, although I'd love it if everybody answered. It seems to me that the identity of the author appears to be central to the work that they produce, at least in the contemporary age, and with Twitter and Facebook. I mean, Emily Rabideau is on Twitter, and when Marilynne Robinson came here, people took selfies with her. It seems to me that there are new stages of authorial performance, and it now authors feel compelled maybe to celebritize themselves a little bit, and how overwhelming that must feel. So my question is, do you think that there's some sort of selection, like natural selection going on, in that the types of people who become writers are the types of people who are comfortable with that sort of attention and spotlight?
I'm going to try to make a small connection to Tiffany's thesis. I think in terms of selection, with any author, there's a certain amount of experience that can be drawn upon. And we see with Conrad, he himself was born in Poland, spoke 3 languages, traveled a ton. He was able to write these adventure novels because he experienced many of the same things that his characters do. And I think when you're talking about contemporary literature, especially literature is concerned with identity, those people that have these liminal identities like Rabideau, like Senna, they are able to kind of more accurately depict those within their characters. And I think that they're also more accurately able to depict the cultural implications of those things. And so in terms of celebritizing themselves, I think that you have websites where they talk about their whole biography, and like that's kind of how I learned that Senna's biography very much matches with Birdie's throughout the novel. I think it becomes more interesting for the reader, but also it becomes kind of a way to see the reality that is reflected within the literature.
Robinson is, similarly well-read. She's an incredibly intellectual person. Her background, I don't think, would imply a life of publicity. She was very, very, small town upbringing, and she is currently notoriously private. The details of her private life are very hard to find unless you go to the archives, and then they're there. So you might think that in this day and age, an author like Robinson would disappear. And I think she kind of has. Her first novel, Housekeeping, it won the PEN Hemingway Award for the best first novel, and that should have shot her to publicity and stardom. But she decided that she preferred a life of more obscurity, and she's hung back, except that one of her biggest fans is Obama. So that makes it a little difficult to stay private when the president interviews you. But as to your question of authorial control and this new aspect, I think despite her reclusivity, that the digital age might help her in that, because she does do interviews, but every interview is very controlled. And so she will repeat the same phrases in 10 different interviews over a decade. And so information that she does not want to get out, it doesn't get out. Tidbit, it's been impossible to find, you know, which is good, where her sons are. Like, this is important to not know where the family members live. Yeah.
There's a curious similarity in two of the authors you mentioned. Neither Auden nor Steinem seem to have had a home. They traveled all the time. I'm curious what you think the role of this rootlessness was in their writing.
So I think that one thing about this rootlessness for Auden is that he will come back to the same places. So maybe even though he's off traveling in many different places and has many different kind of like temporary homes, in his writing, he'll come back to the same places over and over again. And maybe that by writing about these different places, he finds some sense of home there.
Yeah, I guess kind of similarly, I think that Steinem would say that she suffers from a similar, her travels lead her to focus more on this idea of home. Part of what she says in My Life on the Road is that, you know, through her life she would go and speak to and about women who were stuck in the house, and yet it was never her story. So there's that strange, you might even say, conflict of interest, that she's speaking for those whom she doesn't actually represent. But you know, the end of her newest book, it ends with this long chapter on her finally, after years of searching for some balance, finally finding a sense of home that she feels she can stay in. So I think it's kind of like Lucille, who will be forever thronged by the loss, right? The second you don't have something, you are continuously reminded of it. So perhaps Steinem, through her life, was constantly reminded that she didn't have a home to go back to, and that's why she spoke for these women who had the opposite experience. Not sure.
Great. Well, I get the privilege of the last question before lunch, to which I heartily invite you. We have a wonderful spread. And this is a classic director's question. I just want to know, what were some of the most difficult moments during this year in the writing of this thesis that you can disclose without giving away too much of your inner life? So what was the hardest sort of moment in a year-long quest to produce a very substantial piece of work? And then what was the biggest surprise in this journey for you? Which might be the aspect of delight I'm looking for, but I'll see. Tiffany?
Yeah, I think I started the project with a million different ideas, and then I think what I struggled with most was, I think, like refining those ideas and getting like a singular argument or sort of that like umbrella of what I wanted to focus on. And one thing that my advisor actually advised me to do, which maybe made it more difficult but also like much better in the long run, was that she kind of wanted me to actually keep exploring like these different paths that I opened up, and not to like limit myself to just a singular argument so early on in the process. And by doing that, I was able to do all of this research surrounding Conrad, surrounding, you know, modernism, adventure, and then finally, I don't think I even got like this argument until very, very recently. So it was like, so I think in the same vein, like my delight and my struggles sort of just like merged together by the end. Like I think my struggles throughout the year were continually having this problem of sort of like, I have all of these different ideas and all of these different critics, you know, saying all these different things, and like, what do I want to say? But then I think that just by the end of the year, by having all of this knowledge, I was able to come to like my own conclusions and like, you know, get it down to a singular like refined argument. So I think that's yeah, it.
For me, in terms of writing and writer's block, which I think we are all plagued with at certain times, the hard part for me was always kind of finding new spaces where new ideas would kind of come into being. So like my characters, I too am kind of affected by the spaces that I'm in. And so large portions of my thesis were written at home on planes in New York City when I was visiting friends. So there's kind of this kind of connectedness that I felt with my characters. In terms of delight, I would say it's always nice to have a new idea and not know where it came from, which is something that definitely occurred early on and then always was surprising when that happened later on in the process.
I think one of the biggest struggles I had was sort of having a bad writing day where you go and you plan like 4 hours to write, and then you're 45 minutes in and you just feel like you can't write anymore. And I think that coming back from those types of days was really challenging for me, and that was one of my biggest struggles. But I think that in terms of my biggest delights from the project, it would be definitely sort of the conversations I had with my advisor after, working really hard on something I'd written and reading the same poems over and over and over again, and kind of coming to, I guess, similar to Zane's, like how exciting it is to have new ideas, and those ideas are your ideas, which are great.
I think my greatest struggle was exactly the same as Tiffany's. I spent most of the year writing about all of these ideas that I had, but not knowing how they fit together. And in fact, I didn't find my argument until April 11th, which is when I finally knew what I was trying to say, which was okay, but that meant that I had to write the entire thing in, 2 months. No, 1 month. 1 month. So this has been a rough month. But for me, the greatest delight is I have read Housekeeping now like 8 times, and it's still my favorite novel. It's beautiful, and I still feel enlivened when I read it, so I suggest it to everybody. But I'm very happy that I didn't, bore myself with it, that I didn't waste it, that I still love it very much. So.
On that wonderful note, can we thank our panel again? We're going to start a little later, 15 minutes later this afternoon than on schedule, so 1:45 to allow some professors who want to see the last 2 presenters make it from their classes. So thank you. Thanks so much.
Professor Stavely, I accidentally took your speech,
fine,
but,
don't worry,
but there it is.
I got it. Many episodes.
Wait, do you want a copy?
You know what? Well, you're not like... You are. Really, you're lying in your mouth. You're by literally how they were today. Everyone loves you. And I like the Angela. That's people let me.